Hello again, I am Blunty. This rig right here is what we're calling double suck, because when we built it live on stream, I accidentally mounted two fans around the wrong way, so they were sucking air into the case from both sides, and I thought it was a catchy name. The build is based around this, which is the brand new MSI B360 Gaming Plus motherboard, which is one of the first budget-minded motherboards that supports Intel's Coffee Lake architecture. So before this came along, if you wanted to run an i3 or an i5, the budget end of the Coffee Lake chips, you had to buy the top-end motherboard. It was ridiculous, and it wasn't smart money spent. Now, you can build a budget gaming rig, smart money spent. This rig is a $500 gaming build, and that's the thing. Most of the time when you see these YouTube videos about a $500 gaming rig, they're made from scrounged up, secondhand, Craigslist, who knows what kind of life it's led kind of deals, without any warranties or anything like that. This build is built from purely new parts you can buy off the shelf right now. From retailers with good reputations, you get the full manufacturer's warranty, all that kind of stuff. So for my money, I think it's a better idea to spend your money on a new rig, maybe spend a little bit more than what you would do on a, cobbled together secondhand Craigslist rig, because going forward, you've got new parts, new warranties, you're going to have fewer problems, you know exactly the kind of life that these parts have led, you don't have to kind of roll the dice on it and hope for the best, but that does mean the conceit I have to make for the, $500 headline is the base rig. It's $500 plus your graphics card. If that triggers you, I'm sorry, but here we are. The base build is $500 worth American dollars, price list and parts list in the below area. And I wanted to see if this new Coffee Lake i3, which has 4 cores instead of the old i3, which had 2 cores but 4 threads, this one has 4 cores, 4 threads. How does it go in a budget-minded gaming rig? Is your money better spent on the higher-end CPU or a higher-end GPU when it comes to this kind of budget rig? So here is the $500 rig. I'm going to match it up with several different cards, and we're going to see if we can find where that bottleneck is that starts choking off performance and where your money is better spent. Now, the idea behind this video is not to find out which graphics card is faster. Obviously, the more expensive ones are faster. We're trying to find out how much faster under this particular rig's burden, and where is that bottleneck? Where is the point of diminishing returns when you're better off spending money elsewhere in the system rather than the graphics card or the CPU, and vice versa. So let's get to it.
To get a bit of a baseline, we'll hit the artificial benchmarks first. In Firestrike, there's a kick up of just over 10%, which is, as the case for most of these tests, right in line with expectations. And again, this isn't really about how much faster the GPU is than another one, but if the Coffee Lake i3 causes any unexpected bottlenecking. The Untitled Valley benchmark, which leans a bit more heavily on the CPU, pushes a 7% difference between the 1050 and 1050 Ti, while the more GPU-focused Heaven benchmark widens the gap to about 11%. Far Cry 5, which has a built-in benchmarking tool, so I've done tests with that and with real-world gameplay using the default high settings at 1080p. With this game, I wanted to target a console-level 30 frames per second, as my own personal playthrough is currently on the Xbox One X, and the 30 FPS cap there hasn't felt detrimental to the game. Of course, if you're more sensitive or picky about it, or PC Master Racy about it, you can always turn down some settings to get up to 60. That said, even the humble i3 and the 1050 family can cope with this beautiful open world game in high settings and at 1080p while staying above 30 frames per second, averaging in fact either side of 40 frames per second. And the benchmark indicator holds out in real world gameplay too, with up to a 10 frames per second difference between the base and the Ti versions of the card. The base 1050's limited to 2GB of VRAM is basically maxed out at all times during open world games like this, but the game engine seems smart enough to smoothly iron out the issues that would normally cause. Now, I'd not call the 1050 ideal for this game, but it is absolutely very playable. In Doom, we see the first evidence of the CPU bottleneck, where we would normally see an 8 to 15% difference in frame rate between these two cards at identical settings. Here, we're basically leveled. both diving to as low as 60 frames per second and reaching into the triple digits in easier areas. So even though in this case we're not reaching the full benefit of the hardware difference, it's still a fully satisfying performance level, spending most of its time in the 70s to 80s. And it is a similar story for Overwatch as well. The TI is leashed slightly by the CPU, offering up a smaller kick than you'd usually expect over the 1050. But once more, the i3 still delivers sufficient grunt to let the game flush out enough frames to call it a good experience, easily allowing the 1050 and 1050 Ti to keep things above 60 frames per second. And lastly, Fortnight, using a mixed arrangement of settings automatically set by the GeForce Experience software as ideal for the 1050, but included in Fortnite default settings is a frame rate cap of 60 frames per second for a highly consistent experience. And in a game like this, arguably, consistency is more important than higher frame rates. Capped at 60 frames per second, neither the GPU or CPU introduce any bottlenecking, the game is smooth and predictable and flat out nailed to 60 frames per second. In a couple of minutes, in another test, I'll unlock the frame rate. But another question on the table is, let's say your budget was a bit larger, enough to strike out to a GTX 1060 for instance, which is a significant upgrade over the 1050 Ti and the current strong recommendation for a superb 1080p gaming experience for AAA titles. With the i3's bottlenecking, while there and obvious in a couple of tests, still not really making any game's performance unacceptable, how much benefit would splashing cash on a more serious gaming GPU reap? Well, back to the artificial benchmarks first. In Firestrike, there's over a 56% boost, pushing the score well past the 10,000 mark. There's a 67% kick up the bum when it comes to Valley, which also keeps the minimum frame rate above that 30 frames per second mark for the first time. And once more, in the more GPU-focused benchmark Heaven, the 1060 gives you more than 78% over the 1050 Ti's score. With Far Cry 5, moving from the high settings I used for the benefit of the 1050, I pushed things up to ultra settings this time, with which the 1050 Ti still managed a very respectable performance, keeping a minimum frame rate of 38 FPS and maxing out to 54, averaging a hearty 45 frames per second. But with no sign of the i3's modest cores holding things back, the 1060 kept a minimum of well above 60 frames per second, averaging 74, and maxing out at 87. Rendering fully 69% more frames across the whole benchmark. And this does hold out in real-world gameplay, which is rather encouraging as far as the usefulness of Far Cry 5's benchmark goes. Canned in-game benchmarks are useful, but not always fully nailing what a real gameplay experience does. Far Cry 5's seems pretty trusty on that. In fact, with so much headroom left on the 1060 in this game, I've flipped up the rest of the graphic options, most significantly the temporal anti-aliasing. The difference wasn't as dramatic as I expected, only losing 3 to 7 frames per second of performance, which still left the game running well above 60 frames per second, double the basic console level performance I targeted for this budget setup, and the elimination of aliasing shimmer and other related artifacting was a very worthwhile difference. I'm actually quite impressed by the Coffee Lake i3 8100. The difference between it and its last generation equivalent, that being the 4 physical cores and 4 threads, over the 2-core 4-thread setup of last generation's Kaby Lake i3 7100. And if you are playing Blue Team, the i3 is more practical as a budget gaming heart than ever before, with the similarly impressive basic AMD choice, the 1300X, at around about the same price. Intel's stronger per-core performance can edge it out slightly here. So you know, thank you, AMD, for finally forcing Intel's hand and making them take some proper steps forward in the progress of CPUs again. Back to the benchmarking though. In Overwatch, where we saw the CPU bottleneck come into play with the 1050 and its Ti brother, unsurprisingly, the same thing happens here. A bottleneck is a bottleneck, and that means a choke chain on performance that doesn't care what your card is. But again, once more, we're still above the 60 frames per second mark I'd consider minimum for a shooter like this. So while there's no real benefit to the pricier GPU with this game, there is in other titles, so it's not a deal-breaker result. And finally, back in Fortnite again, with the same standard default settings along with that 60 frames per second cap, obviously nothing changes here. But with the 1060 on board, why don't we unlock that and kick everything up from Nvidia's recommended 1050 settings all the way up to Epic and unlock that frame rate? Result? Frame rates in the 80s and 90s, so there's plenty of headroom above that standard 60 frames per second cap, even while maxed out. So, at the end of the day, a GPU to complement the $500 USD base system I built around the Intel i3 8100 and the newly released and finally appropriately budget-friendly MSI B360 Gaming Plus motherboard, any of the three recommended cards will do very nicely indeed. And yes, by now I'm sure someone has commented that I've only tested Nvidia cards. And while I do have an RX 460 and an RX 470 on my shelf, I don't have what's currently on retail shelves, the 500 series. Admittedly, they're very similar, and in any case, at this end of the market, I do have a strong preference for Team Green. Once we get to the higher end with the Vega 56, that decision between green and red becomes much harder, but here, I feel like Team Green has a better bang at the lower end. In any case, like I said at the beginning of this video, this was more about finding where the quad-cored Coffee Lake i3 starts holding things back rather than a pure GPU shootout. And it's pretty clear, on that score, I feel like I can recommend the i3 8100 to budget gaming builders without hesitation. Stepping up to the more common recommendation for gaming rigs, the i5 asks for fully 100 Aussie dollars more, and in a budget build, that cash is significant, and it's probably better spent pushing the GPU further.
That $100 Australian can be the difference between a GTX 1050 Ti and a GTX 1060, and we just saw what a significant difference that can make on the same rig with the same CPU. There was only a couple of instances where the bottleneck was in place, and that bottleneck was in place regardless of what sort of GPU we used with it. So your money, it seems, if you want to build a budget-priced rig, your base price of $500 plus your choice of graphics card, you're better off spending the extra money on the graphics card than you are upgrading the CPU. So yeah, I think the verdict is the i3 can, does, and will make a very good choice for a budget-minded gaming rig. And when it comes down to weighing it up between its AMD equivalent, the 1300X, the 1300X is a little more expensive. We already know Intel in general have better per-core performance, so this rig is probably going to outweigh an equivalent rig with the 1300X in it for around about the same kind of cash. So again, thank you AMD for finally waking up Intel so we can get some actual competition back in the marketplace, because we win! But there you are. I hope that has been interesting or insightful or useful or some other adjective. I hope you enjoyed watching anyway. Thanks for watching. I am Blunty, and I will catch you next time. For those of you who might have missed the videos, I'll link them down below, but there is an unboxing and overview of the motherboard in greater detail. And there is also another video which covers the entire live build. We built this live on stream over on Twitch, and I put that up on YouTube for the replay there. So if you managed to miss the live stream, you can watch it through there. If you're curious to I mean, it's not really a how-to kind of build thing, but we had a lot of cool conversations about the various components and pros and cons and all that sort of stuff, and gave some advice. So yeah, check that out, and go over and give the Twitch channel a follow just in case you want to hang on around next time we do a live build or play some video games, for example.